So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So, yesterday we were actually talking about some details. قل أي شيء أكبر شهادة قل الله شهيد بيني وبينكم وأوحي إلي هذا القرآن لأنذركم به ومن بلغ أئنكم لتشهدون أن مع الله آلهة أخرى قل لا أشهد قل إنما هو إله واحد وإنني بريء مما تشركون. So we left off at these ayat yesterday, and we did talk about وَإِن يَمْسَسْكَ اللَّهُ بِضُرٍّ فَلَا كَاشِفَ لَهُ إِلَّا هُوَ. We went in certain details, and we promised that we were going to go to Tafseer al-Qurtubi to discuss further in relationship with those ayat, because we talked about some of the things that we could read in the ayat, but certainly there's a lot more to say when it comes to Tafsir al-Qurtubi. We talked about وَهُوَ الْقَاهِرُ فَوْقَ عِبَادِهِ وَهُوَ الْحَكِيمُ الْخَبِيرُ, and we talked about al-qahr. We talked about something that is called taklif. In other words, so if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control of everything, does that mean we don't have free will? So we explained that no, there are certain things that you have the free will in, and despite your free will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still basically would be the one that you would act in basically within the will of. In other words, you probably may choose to, let's say, get married, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had known, and you would not be getting married unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed it. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is beyond time and place, that is the Lord Almighty being beyond time and place, that's why He would know beforehand that you were going to make this choice, and at the same time, He had willed. In other words, He had already known, He had decreed, and He basically allowed it to happen. He had allowed it to happen, and that's one area of al-qadr itself. But there's another area of al-qadr that you don't have any control over. It's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qahr. It's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala overcoming your ability in all ends and in all angles, and you don't have any power over that. And usually, and of course, those areas are where we would see, for example, whether it's in death, it's in sleep, or certain choices that you may have no ability to change. You have no free will that can change anything, but you can have certain free will to probably, let's say, cure, to probably change some of the things, but all of that is within the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So al-qahir would be the one that overpowers, that overcomes your power, and certainly it's beyond every single person, every ibad, all Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's servants, whether the person is Muslim or not. That's why it said فَوْقَ عِبَادِهِ وَهُوَ الْحَكِيمُ الْخَبِيرُ. And قُلْ أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَكْبَرُ شَهَادَةٍ. What is a better and what more or a higher evidence and a witness do you want? So when you say akbaru shahada, the word shahada can mean witness and can also mean evidence. قُلْ أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَكْبَرُ شَهَادَةٍ. What higher and what better evidence or witness do you want other than Allahu shahidun bayni wa baynakum? When you say قُلْ, remember when we had said in Surah Al-An'am, there were a lot of quls, and we said with the quls, it's basically to, one, give the inspiration of pride, Muslim confidence, and certainly the strength to give the answers with that pride, and not necessarily wait for the other person to define you. So keep that one in mind. Sometimes we, as Muslims, we have gotten so used to being the subject of others' definition that we forget that, no, don't wait for others to define you. You stand to define yourself, and let other people, you teach them how you want to be defined, how you want to say the truth, how you want your religion to be presented. You stand out, and you stand up, and you stand strong to say, well, this is what the faith is. This is how I explain it. This this is how I demonstrate it, and so forth. And don't let others define you. And alhamdulillah, we definitely see during our times the confidence that many Muslims have to actually stand up and do that definition. But still, we still have a lot of work to do because we don't have a lot of, let's say, media outlets that basically are in the position to, of course, be the ones to define everything on our behalf and basically give that demonstration of what we want, basically from our viewpoint. And certainly, قُلْ أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَكْبَرُ شَهَادَةٍ is basically teaching us to stand and bring the definition and bring the presentation for ourselves and not let others do it on our behalf. وَأُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنُ لِأُنذِرَكُمْ بِهِ وَمَنْ بَلَغَ. That's where we left off at. And let's, inshallah, right there, قُلْ أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَكْبَرُ شَهَادَةٍ. And we talked about that the main reason, of course, this ayah was basically telling us in terms of قل الله شهيد بيني وبينكم, and what is the shahada? What is the witness? Is the witness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had what we had called the open book. And when we talk about the open book, we're talking about the universe basically speaking in the loudest words, in the most apparent evidence about and basically speaking to demonstrate the magnificence of the Lord Almighty. Or is this witness referring to a specific witness? What specific witness? That's the witness that you could see in the following ayah. الذين آتيناهم الكتاب يعرفونه كما يعرفون أبناءهم. What witness is this bringing up? This is bringing up the witness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about the prophecies. This is bringing about the witnesses in terms of the prophecies when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had foretold about the coming of the Prophet, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or even the other prophets. Now, some scholars actually said, يَعْرِفُونَهُ. This isn't necessarily referring to the Prophet himself because this is a pronoun and nothing was actually talking about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself, only the context. Other scholars, they said يَعْرِفُونَهُ to meaning أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ, meaning this is the nearest noun that was mentioned. In other words, that they would recognize that the words that are contained, the message that is basically sent onto the prophet is basically the same message that was sent onto the prophets before. So they would know the message, they would recognize the message, and therefore recognize that this prophet is not an impostor, but a prophet that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent. كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم, as they would know their own children. In other words, they recognize the prophecy, they recognize the wordings, they recognize the message that is in it, and therefore they recognize the source of it. They recognize the source of this message, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They recognize the principles that are taught within it. It is to basically bring in justice, to bring in the foundations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set in other scriptures, the principles of preserving the deen, preserving life, preserving mental health, preserving family, and certainly preserving wealth. So the DNAIM, if you remember that one. Okay, so when we're speaking about that one, قُلْ أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَكْبَرُ شَهَادَةٍ, that's what al-Qurtubi wanted to talk about. So al-Qurtubi went in certain details and he said, قُلْ أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَكْبَرُ شَهَادَةٍ, that the first one is mainly and that's basically what he considered as the preponderant, that mainly this is referring to the witness, meaning the prophecies that were revealed onto the previous prophets and messengers, onto the previous scriptures, that the Prophet ﷺ was prophesied and that there was going to be a coming prophet. Now, here's one thing. When you look at for example, the different scriptures, or at least let's say we talked about yesterday Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, and we talked about just some of those. We talked about the details before, so I'm not going to go back to it. I'm just here, just reminding you of it. Can we necessarily say that this is our evidence and this is, or somebody can actually go perhaps into the Song of Songs and say, hey, just like at the end, and it says Vizay Muhammadim or something like that, and meaning that this is the praised one and the all praised one, etc. Can we necessarily use that as evidence to prove and therefore defend such interpretation that it's referring to the Prophet ﷺ? I mean, for your own personal argument, it's up to you if you would like to do that. If you would like to say, well, here's my evidence, and I'm going to the scriptures. And, I would see a lot of the different Muslims sometimes being ardent, I would say, in considering that there's no other interpretation but interpreting that this is referring to the Prophet ﷺ and so forth. What I want to say is that we cannot necessarily be so ardent and so definitive in saying this is referring to the Prophet ﷺ, because in general, the scripture itself we consider was actually edited. So whether we're speaking about the scripture, whether we're speaking about the interpretation, had basically fallen under one. Resources that did not necessarily keep the records of those resources, let's call it intact, and let's say in a place where we would be so I guess so trustworthy of those resources. In other words, we can't necessarily be so definitive. We can't necessarily be so ardent about that this particular verse is referring to the Prophet ﷺ, and if you don't believe so, then you're a kafir. No. That's a perspective that you can get an inspiration from, but not necessarily feel that you have to believe that this is what the Old Testament, in particular, mainly, or even the New Testament, if sometimes we can get some inspiring texts to tell us that this is giving us a prophecy about the Prophet ﷺ. So just wanted to say that if a person denies that that's the evidence that proves the prophecy about the Prophet ﷺ, that doesn't make the person a kafir. Okay. They don't want to believe that that's the inspiration, that's fine. Okay. But if they're denying the Quran, and if the person is denying the evidences in the Sirah, in basically the evidences that the Prophet ﷺ was a prophet through the Quran, the Sunnah, the Sirah, etc., then that's a kafir. But if a person denies that such texts are basically referring to the Prophet ﷺ, that doesn't make a person a kafir. That's something that they can say, well, yes, I believe in the Prophet ﷺ. I believe Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. In other words, they believe in all of that, but they don't necessarily see that the text that some are saying that they are pointing to the Prophet ﷺ, that they don't believe that that's referring to the Prophet ﷺ, and they don't believe that it would be accurate to use that as evidence. That's absolutely fine. I personally feel that my favorite interpretation, my favorite at least, is in Isaiah, when it was talking about that the Lord will shine from Seir, and he will shine from Paran, and he will shine, and he had shined in Sinai, and he will shine in Paran. That one was actually my favorite out of all. The one in Deuteronomy, I will put my words, or I will send, what is it, uh, something like a person or another prophet from amongst their brethren, and he will speak basically my words, or I will put my words in his mouth, all of that. It can actually carry multiple interpretations. Of course, the Christians would say that that's referring to Prophet Isa alayhi salam. The Jews will say, well, no, this is actually talking about a false prophet. And a lot of the Muslims like to use that as an inspiration to prove that this is referring to the Prophet ﷺ himself, because it was referring to Kedar, and Kedar happens to be the children of Ishmael in the Old Testament, and therefore something referring to the children of Kedar, meaning Ismail alayhi salam, meaning the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that was, I guess, the inspiration that a lot of Muslims had basically interpreted that text referring to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Regardless of how some might actually see that inspiration, regardless of how some might see that inspiration. But at the end, of course, denying the Prophet ﷺ, using the evidences and seeing the evidences with this one. قُلِ اللَّهُ شَهِيدٌ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is my witness. And وَأُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ. And this Qur'an was delivered onto me. In other words, the Qur'an is the biggest evidence to prove the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ, and not necessarily the other inspirations, or let me say the other inspiring texts, meaning the Old Testament or the New Testament. Okay. لأنذركم به ومن بلغ. So let's look at this one. أي شيء أكبر شهادة. Of course, because the disbelievers had said that the Prophet ﷺ, who is going to question the Prophet ﷺ, interrogated him basically, who's going to witness and be your witness that you were a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this ayah was revealed. Okay, now وَأُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ, and this Qur'an is basically the evidence to prove the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ. So when we look at the witnesses in the Qur'an, it's important to mention that the most important witness in the Qur'an is the eloquence that is in the Qur'an itself. That's the most important evidence. I know some would like to use the scientific evidences and scientific miracles and so forth, but it's important to note that the most important evidence is, or the most important witness within the Quran is basically the eloquence of the Quran, and that's why in the Quran itself it was emphasizing إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا. It was revealed in Arabic. And the question is, as a person that does not speak fluent Arabic, how can I see the miracle of the eloquence, at least, that is in the Quran? Well, I'll tell you one thing. During our times, no one is actually capable of speaking the eloquence that is in the Quran, or even during the time of the Quran, when the Quran was revealed, even the pagan Arab, who were considered to being the best in the highest and the best in the eloquence in Lugha Arabiya, when the Quran was revealed, it was challenging them to bring something similar to the eloquence that the Quran had come with. And certainly it was coming to them to challenge them to bring a surah, then it challenged them to bring a chapter, or at least a part of it, 10 ayat, and then one ayah, but they could not actually match that, even though they had definitely tried, because they wanted to disprove and refute and bring any rebuttal that there is in order to prove and disprove that the Prophet ﷺ is a prophet and prove that he is nothing but an impostor. And they tried in different ways. And certainly when we would get the note in the story of al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, when he comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he was using all his attempt to convince the Prophet ﷺ, he tries to convince the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ just reads certain ayat from Surah Fussilat. But then he says, stop, I cannot take this any longer. This is bigger and farther than my power to comprehend the words. But he comes out and he says his witness, and it was basically recorded because he had said it in public, and he said he had recited something. He said, inna alayhi innahu lahalawa inna alayhi latalawa, that it is the most beautiful thing that I had ever heard, and it contains the most eloquent words, and he said this quote, and they're the words of not a human being and not a demon and not a jinn, basically. But what was the reason that they still, like al-Walid ibn al-Mughira or others, what was the reason that they had still rejected the words, and what was the reason, despite them knowing that the eloquence was nothing that they could match, was nothing that was in any shape or form matching any of what they had heard, whether in the information contained or whether in the eloquence presented, or whether in the miracles that the Prophet ﷺ, whether we're speaking about the Quran as a miracle, or whether we're speaking about the different stories that were miracles, at least let's call them the miracles, let's call them materialistic miracles, because they were capable of seeing it, they were capable of witnessing it with their own eyes. So when we're looking at the Quran itself and the reason why they wanted to reject it, there were a couple reasons why they wanted to reject it. Number one was kibr, was really pride, because they did not want just any random person, even though the Prophet ﷺ wasn't any random person. They did know his progeny, they did know his ancestry, he did come from a noble tribe, but they still considered that they were in a much noble position, and that they were the ones that they should have been chosen to be in such position because they were the chieftains. That's the first thing. The second reason is that they were worried about their economy, because Mecca was an area that was not fertile, and not having fertile grounds was going to mean that that was going to be the end of any resources that was going to be, or that were going to be coming to Mecca. The reason for that is because Mecca at this time was only gaining its importance through religious tourism. So the religious tourism, people would come basically from different parts of the Arabian Peninsula in order to do their pilgrimage for the idols there. There were 360 idols. The 360 idols basically demonstrated this religious tourism and bringing in the people from different parts of Arabia, and certainly while they were coming in, that was bringing in trade, that was bringing in basically their means of survival. So they considered that by losing the religious tourism and by giving up what brings them the income, that was going to mean basically that their existence was going to get extinct. It was endangered, and that wasn't something that they could at all jeopardize or risk whatsoever. So they basically opposed everything in the Quran, for one, for ego reasons, two, for certainly economical reasons, and number three, it was also for military reasons. Why military reason? The military reason within all of this is that the Arab they were not, at least the ones in Mecca. Okay, the ones in Mecca were not actually the best in military. In fact, they were always keen in making sure that the area was safe enough for trade to continue. And that's why they made the law. It was more like not an international law, but within that, at least within that region, the law was going to be there during the times, Ashhur al-Hurum, basically, during the times of pilgrimage. We need to all agree within that region that there can be no war whatsoever in order to maintain high security for basically that religious tourism to continue and make sure that everyone is feeling safe, and therefore making sure and ensuring that people would feel safe to continue coming into Mecca for that religious tourism. So, having that being said, they did recognize that such a message, if they were to embrace, was actually going to be something that they would have to defend. They would have to stand in ground, in full ground to support, and that was going to bring in a lot of opposition from the different tribes and certainly from the different religions, whether within the Arabian Peninsula or even elsewhere. So they considered that their life was going to be at risk in needing to support such message. So that was one reason, because though if you were to look at the people of Medina, they recognized, remember when Asad ibn Zurara, he stood and he said, listen, before you give the pledge to the Prophet ﷺ, that was during the Al-Aqaba al-Ula, or al-Thaniya actually, that was during the pledge of Al-Aqaba al-Thaniya, when Asad ibn Zurara stands up and he says, well, wait a minute, before you pledge to the Prophet ﷺ, I want you to think and sink into the words and recognize, if you're capable of defending this word, then embrace it and give the pledge to the Prophet ﷺ. But if you cannot, you have to recognize that the whole universe is going to be standing in opposition to this call. In other words, going to be fighting you, and you are going to be right there needing and required to put your life, your children, your wealth, and certainly your commitment in defense of this message. If you're capable of doing so, then do so. But if you're not capable of doing so, then right this minute, just ask the Prophet ﷺ to dismiss you and seek forgiveness, that you're not capable of being strong enough to defend this message. And this is important. You know, Asad ibn Zurara at the time was a young teenager, by the way. He wasn't the eldest, okay? He wasn't the eldest of the Sahaba, but you could see that Asad ibn Zurara only being really a teenager at the time. And you need to keep in mind that although the hadith is not authentic, when the Prophet ﷺ said, Nusirtu bishabab, the hadith is not authentic, but the meaning itself is actually true. The ones to bring the most support to Islam and to the Prophet ﷺ were actually the younger generation. It was really the younger teenagers. If you look at Mus'ab ibn Umair, he was only 16. You look at Mu'adh ibn Jabal, he was only also 17, around 17, 18. You look at the other Sahaba, you look at, for example, other Sahaba, Abdullah ibn Umar was still young. You look at Urwa ibn Zubayr, or Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, sorry, you look at Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. Zubayr ibn al-Awwam was approximately 13 when he had become Muslim. You look at most of the Sahaba, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was still young versus his brother Aqil was way older than him, but he had become Muslim way before Aqil, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, Ali ibn Abi Talib himself. So you're looking at the younger generation really being at the forefront and certainly not influenced by the culture of fear. Of course, the older you are, the more worry you would have, and the younger you are, the most courage you would basically have because you're not afraid of the consequence. You're not afraid of the consequence, and I would really recommend teaching boys martial arts, especially if we're talking about age 12, 13, 14, because that definitely, especially during our times when our children, of course, we are trying to protect them from the streets, from the different neighborhoods and all the different things that would spread within those neighborhoods. But I would say we need an alternative to basically get the courage inside of those boys and certainly build within them the courage, the strength, and certainly the empowerment that is necessary in order to let them be the ones to speak their identity and not have somebody speak it for them. Okay. أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَشْهَدُونَ أَنَّ مَعَ اللَّهِ آلِهَةً أُخْرَى. I just wanted to mention this piece of it. وَأُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ. And the Quran is basically the witness on the Prophet's prophethood. لِأُنذِرَكُمْ بِهِ. I want you to look at this one. لِأُنذِرَكُمْ. So what was the main reason why the Quran was revealed? Number one, it's an al-inzar. It's basically to bring that warning. If you go back to Surah al-Muddathir, قل, or يا أيها المدثر, there's no قل, but يا أيها المدثر قم فأنذر. يا أيها المدثر قم فأنذر. You could see that the main mission and the main service that the Prophet ﷺ was basically sent to do and to give was basically to bring the warning in regards to what? The warning about our judgment day, the warning about this life was created for a purpose, and the warning that this life is not for entertainment. In other words, it is to be taken seriously. You are held accountable. Your words are basically being recorded. Your actions, they're also being recorded. And therefore, لِأُنذِرَكُمْ, the Quran is there. The Quran was revealed in order to warn you of what's coming up next in the hereafter, which is accountability. In all the potentials that you were given, and that you're going to be basically held accountable for all the different things, the potentials that you were given, whether it's your life or whether it's your health or whether it's different, let's call it personal potentials, maybe your intelligence, maybe your wealth, maybe your children, maybe your status, social status, all of those different areas. That's basically going to be what you're going to be held accountable for. And therefore, you have to recognize that there is a magnificent day that is going to be coming at you, and that this is coming up, and there's no doubt about it. وَمَنْ بَلَغ. Let's look at وَمَنْ بَلَغ for a little bit. Because وَمَنْ بَلَغ, the word بَلَغَ means reached, okay? So the word balagha, to reach something, are we talking about the message reaching the people, or are we talking about the people basically once they reach the age of puberty, that's when they will be taken seriously? In other words, held accountable for what choices they would be doing. Is that what we're speaking about? And that's that differences of opinions. The scholars had differences of opinions on whether this is talking about that the Quran had reached them or whether this is talking about reaching the age of puberty. Is there a difference? I don't necessarily think that there's a difference. And the reason for that, I think they go together because you would not be held accountable for believing or for rejecting the faith unless you had reached the age of puberty. So if a child does not believe and they're still questioning or they're still asking questions, and this is important, when a child is asking questions about how do we prove the Quran and questioning things, I would say, don't rush and tell them, oh, don't say that, don't ask this question, etc. That basically leaves them thinking that that Islam doesn't have any answers to their questions. Give them the time, give them the space to freely ask those questions without feeling that they are basically left to embrace the faith without any evidence, and it's nothing but a place of fear. So giving that space and having that space for the children to question, for the children to basically get that the answers to the questions and basically that message being clear to them, that's their space. And if they reach the age of puberty, and this is important to keep in mind, Ibn Taymiyyah used to say, look at this one. Ibn Taymiyyah used to say, I would renew my faith every day. What does that mean? Every single day he's a revert? Why? Did he just believe in order to start believing again? No, it's basically enhancing his faith. So he would basically do Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. In other words, to revive his commitment to the faith, his commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and basically revive it as many times as he can. So when we're speaking about reaching the age of puberty, what does that look like? So puberty is basically in 5 stages in general. Okay, in the earliest stage, you don't really see that the boy or the girl is going through puberty. You don't really see it. It's more of hormonal. You don't recognize it. It isn't until the first stage that you will start seeing pubic hair, probably some slight changes in perhaps in the body. You would see, signs of certain features starting to at least start to appear. In the third stage for boys, you could see the thickness of the voice, and certainly the genital area is usually the place of changes because it's preparing for reproduction. And it's not, we usually focus on genitalia, we usually focus on those changes, that there's that reproduction system basically getting completed in its development, but we rarely connect that development to mental development. And it's quite sad because in Islam, it does emphasize that along with this reproduction development is actually coming another type of development, which is mental development. But unfortunately, during our times, we're basically just focusing on the puberty development, meaning the reproduction, basically the reproductive system, and that's the development. And then not and giving them like a green card that when you are in that age, that it's normal to make the wrong choices, that it's normal to be silly, that it's normal to basically act in ways that are I guess, getting carried away with your own development, at least development, whether it's sexual or whether it's behavioral, and that it's okay, it's basically normal, and they would usually call it the teenage, etc. But in Islam actually took teenage probably as the most serious age. And be careful with that one. It is the most serious age within the development because you could see that that this is considered as the foundation. that age is the foundational age because they are at the climax of one, their mental development, at least it's not a complete mental development. You don't actually complete your mental development until perhaps first it's the age of 26 and then at the age of 40. But when we're speaking about the strength in terms of your ability to probably enhance your intelligence, that's the age for it. The choices and learning how to make the right choices, learning how to channel these choices in these powers that are right now going stronger and stronger, that you're basically making them be consistent with a certain mission. Okay, so having that being said, to put that power and empower them, that you have that power, recognize it in order for it to be within a certain mission, and channel that power to basically be the identity and the mission that you would go for. That's that area that we need to focus on within our community, and not necessarily give that, oh, it's just a young teenager, nothing to worry about, because this is very important to emphasize within our community, that teenagers are perhaps the most important group that we should educate, that we should focus on. And I would actually like to speak about one program. And that man, he did something really important. He's actually in our modern times, and he has a program. And let me bring it up right here. Okay. So this guy, he's originally from Saudi Arabia. Okay, right now residing in Turkey. What he did was really amazing. I want you to look at this one. He was basically giving classes in Quran, classes. I want you to look at the kids that are sitting around him. They're 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So basically in their in pre-puberty, or some of them still going through puberty. And what he did was invest in this younger generation. And he was giving them classes in Quran, classes in Hadith, classes in Tafseer, and they were classes that were considered as intensive classes. In these intensive classes, you would usually think that those classes are only supposed to be taught at a college level, but he respected the minds of those young teenagers and invested in them. And these young teenage boys basically became the pioneers to create a change. And right now, this guy is considered one of the most important figures in let's say in at least the Arabia, basically the Arabic countries, to make the change and invest in those young boys. The young boys are basically a power and a dynamo of energy. If that energy is not used in the right place, they would basically be the energy to destruct the ummah. You could either use that energy to empower the ummah, to strengthen the ummah, or this energy will come at you, basically bringing in destruction. And that's a lesson to learn in our modern times. And he basically has children, almost 50,000 students right now are joining his program. Just imagine that. Almost 50,000, if not even more. And I was listening to the lectures. I was really surprised that the level that he was teaching them in, because he was talking to them about subjects that I'll tell you would normally taught in the postgraduate programs. at the university level, that was usually, and those were the subjects that we were discussing in our masters, the postgraduate, in our graduate and postgraduate classes. But again, he was capable of making it something that was available for the younger children. And he was capable of breaking it down for them. And with their ability to understand, and basically because it was broken down for them, they were capable of making a huge investment within the society. So they were making programs in Turkey, programs in Syria, in programs in Palestine, programs in Saudi Arabia. But then, of course, it was hunted down in Saudi Arabia because certainly in Saudi Arabia, they didn't like that program because they felt that that program was basically going to be targeting the agenda that the Saudi government is right now trying to basically bring in, which is secularism. And then this guy became the number one enemy to that agenda, basically. Okay, but in Egypt, there are also people that are learning for that program. So just wanted to just look at that. لأنذركم به ومن بلغ. We get the inspiration that ومن بلغ, reaching the age of puberty, and having those teenagers basically be the pioneers to be the ones to carry the mission of basically warning others, taking the mission seriously, and being the pioneers to change the world is extremely important. You just connect these two together and just see, of course, when we were talking about the younger generation of the Sahaba, we were talking about Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. And by the way, many of them were actually raised by single parents. Okay, Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, his father had actually died way before he was born. His father actually died in the battle that had happened. The Arab, the Bedouins that were surrounding Mecca. Okay, it was basically the battle. That was the only battle that they had actually faced, and they basically were defeated in that battle because they were business people, so they weren't experts in fighting. And Zubair ibn Awam's father happens to be amongst the ones that were basically killed in that battle of Bu'ath. Okay. أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَشْهَدُونَ أَنَّ مَعَ اللَّهِ آلِهَةً أُخْرَى. Is this necessarily asking them to answer the question? What does that look like? أَإِنَّكُمْ, أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَشْهَدُونَ, are you witnessing or believing that there are other lords or other deities with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So here's the thing. In Lugha Arabiya is very intricate. In Lugha Arabiya, you can have a wording or a certain quote that may seem like it's a question or it's an interrogative clause, but it's actually not an interrogative clause, but it's a clause to expose what they were really claiming. So this isn't an interrogative clause, but this is basically a clause to show exposure, to tell them, well, this is what you would witness. Do you actually believe that? Do you actually hold this position when you would recognize that the world is going in one pattern and that there aren't any opposing patterns? Do you really witness that? And it's not an interrogative clause seeking an answer from them, but this is a clause that is exposing their faith right there and saying, well, this is what you believe in. Can you tell me what you believe in? So based on what you are saying that there are more than one God. There's more than one God, and that there are multiple gods, and then these gods, you're worshiping basically these idols right there. Is this what you believe in? And then, I must admit, right now, during our age, We are seeing younger generation, and before, let's talk about some of those figures that did an outstanding job. I think Zach and no one beats this guy. And I really mean no one beats this guy. In the interfaith, or well, he wouldn't like the word interfaith, but I'll just still use it. Okay, in the dialogues that he had done, and I would say before he was better at it. Right now, I think he's starting to lose patience somehow. I guess with age that happens, but and right now he's actually living in the same city that I'm living in Malaysia. But ironically, he's not allowed to speak in public. He's in the same city. He's literally just a couple blocks away from where I'm living in, but he's not allowed to talk to people. He's not allowed to hold any public speeches, any public talks, even though he's literally just a couple blocks away from me, but he's not allowed to hold any public talks. So anyhow, but when he was in India, the ability to memorize, quote the verses in Arabic, in English, in Sanskrit, when he was quoting basically the Hindu scriptures, and even the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it was like we had never seen. Not even Ibn Taymiyyah. Not even Ibn Taymiyyah. Even if you were to go back to the book الجواب الصحيح لمن بدل دين المسيح for Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Taymiyyah was quoting off someone else. His name is Sama'u ibn Yahya. Okay, so even Ibn Taymiyyah and even other scholars, they were not necessarily at the memory, the ability to quote with verse number and chapter number, and even the quote itself, and compare and jump from one verse to another in the Quran, in the Bible, in the New Testament, the Old Testament, even in the Hindu scriptures. This is something like we had never seen before, to be honest. And later, of course, his children basically learned from him as well. And his son is also doing something similar. And certainly, I guess it's worthy of mention. There is another group, I think they're called Sapien or something. I don't know why they called it that, but I don't know why they called it that. Let me see. Okay, I guess serpent. Was it serpent? And let's see, atheism, maybe that would help. No, maybe I would put Hamza Source, maybe, right? Source, maybe that's what it is. Don't know what that, I don't know what that, let's see. I think they're doing an outstanding job, and I think it's worth mentioning their work and the dawah that they're doing. So I'm trying to, can't remember. You know what? I have their book right there. I think, give me that book right there. I have that book. Yeah. So what is it called? Oh, Sapiens. Yeah, let's look into it. And let's see, Sapiens. Okay. Okay, well, that was supposed Sapiens and Hamza. Let's write it like that. Hamza. Okay, this is it. So this is basically their institute. And I think they're doing an outstanding job, along with Muhammad Hijab, and basically, that group. I think they're doing an outstanding job at least in the English language. I think they're doing an outstanding job in delivering the message, and especially for the younger generation. And I would mean the teenage boys, in particular boys. Boys are always many times left out, and I would personally claim that it's harder to work with boys than girls sometimes, because boys are challenging. The boys are really challenging, and boys are usually looking for male figures to take as an example. And girls don't mind having male figures as an example, but boys have a problem with having male figures. They don't want a female figure as an example. They want a male figure as an example. Okay. Uh, it's strange, but anyhow, and I think they do an outstanding job. And I had seen a number of different young men actually get inspired by this institute and by, I think it was also called Ayana or something like that, that Muhammad Hijab was doing. And I had seen a lot of younger boys inspired by them. And while I was at the university, I had seen many younger boys basically want to mimic and imitate Hamza Tzoris and also Muhammad Hijab and their group and what kind of da'wah that they were doing. And they were always getting that confidence basically from that inspiration. So just wanted to note that one because I know since we're talking about teenagers, what other resources do you have for the boys? And I'm just giving you these resources that would be helpful. Okay, let's see. يا أيها الرسول بلغ ما أنزل إليك من ربك. I don't know why, but I think someone's asking, well, what about girls? What resources do you have for girls? So for girls, one, Alhamdulillah, Gems of Light, we're trying to create, I guess, the foundation for ilm. I know our institute wasn't always the most attractive for younger girls and younger teenage girls, but I would say Jannah Institute, I do see that they were also making some programs for younger girls as well. I know Dr. Haifa is trying to bring certain figures to attract the younger women. What is it called? I think it was called Rabata with Tamra Gray. She also has certain programs for younger girls. Although sometimes, I disagree with the feminist approach sometimes, but I think they're doing an outstanding job in trying to, I guess, create the space for younger women. It's called Rabata with Tamra Gray. I know that Hikmah Academy with Kaltoon Karani, she's also trying to do, I guess, some work with the younger girls and younger teenage girls. I know that there was Pearls. They were also trying to do some work with the younger girls. It's quite sad to say that that the women's corner, let's call it that way, it's quite sad to say that the women's corner at many times, and it's hard to find women's corners that are not infiltrated by feminism. Sorry, ladies. I must admit that. It's quite sad to see that a lot of the da'iyas were actually influenced with the feminist rhetoric, and unfortunately, they thought that we can embrace the feminist rhetoric in empowering women, but empowering women through Islam is completely different than empowering women through the feminist rhetoric. So just be careful about that one. Jamaluddin, I know she has some programs. Jamaluddin, maybe I could just bring her up, right? Jamaluddin, I know she has programs. Jamaluddin, I hope I'm writing this one right. Okay, this is her. Jamaluddin. She had a program, and she still has a program in Australia. She's not only working with younger women, but she's working with women at different ages. MashaAllah, Jamaluddin is a very dedicated woman, MashaAllah. And I must say she's one of this is basically her. I must say I'm very, very proud of what she's doing. And mashallah, memorized the Quran, had the ijazah. She's a revert herself and works to, one, educate the girls, inspire the girls, and even learn herself. She herself is working hard to expand her knowledge. And I was basically, trying to help her and on one of the projects that she was doing for her graduate program. But I must admit, mashallah, very smart, very intelligent woman, and نحسبها على خير. Definitely recommend your young daughters to learn from her and join her programs as well. So that's, I guess, just some resources out there. يا أيها الرسول بلغ ما أنزل إليك من ربك, and that's basically the whole idea of tabligh. What is tabligh? Tabligh is not the organization da'wah and tabligh, okay? Although I think that what they're doing is outstanding. The Jama'at al-Tabligh, certainly sometimes they definitely would make use and probably would need some ilm to be added and invested within their corners, but I think they're doing an outstanding job in creating circles of dhikr, creating circles of inspiring the generations themselves, the generations to learning seerah, connecting with Islam, and taking the time to be away from this fast and fast world and connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, taking the time to sleep at the masjid, do the dhikr at the masjid. I think that's very much needed. But this isn't talking about the da'wah with tabligh as an organization, but this is actually talking about the general idea, man balagh, meaning that this risala was to warn them and warn anybody that, one, received the message of the Quran, two, basically reach the age of puberty. So basically two. Okay, let's see right there. قِيلَ وَمَنْ بَلَغَ الْحُلُمْ, right there, reach the age of puberty. And, well, what does it mean لِأُنذِرَكُمْ and التبليغ? What does it mean? What's the difference between إنذركم, النذر, basically, or الإنذار, and giving it tabligh? Okay, التبليغ, when you say the word balagha, actually means reached. So tabligh would be the process to let the message reach certain people. Okay, that's tabligh. Versus al-indhar is to warn. So it's basically al-indhar and al-tabshir. Okay, al-tabshir, although right now, I guess the ones that won us to the beautiful word is the tabshir, basically. It's a very beautiful word. It basically means to bring glad tidings, but right now it basically is referred to the missionaries. And they had beat us to that word. To be honest, I wish that we had used tabshir as the word to refer to da'wah. With the word to refer to da'wah, because da'wah is more as you're just making a call, but at tabshir, you're bringing a glad tiding. You're just telling somebody that there's something good coming up. Okay, so I wish that the Muslims had embraced that word before them, but right now, I guess, we could be creative in making I guess, our da'wah and giving it nice names in order to make it attractive and to bring the message closer to people's hearts than just something that we're just making a call and you have to make the decision. Okay, so tabligh al-Quran was sunnah, basically telling and informing people about the Quran and sunnah is an obligation. Okay, so sister is saying she's got a question. have a question about something Muhammad Hijab said. It's off topic, so if it's more appropriate for the Q&A, that's okay. Interview, popular person said that it's okay and encourage men to get a second wife without mentioning to the first, even though it's okay for men to have multiple wives. Kind of approach, is it permissible? If she had kids and decides that it's not a union, can she take part in it and the family breaks up? Okay, so let me say one thing. When we endorse somebody, that doesn't necessarily mean we're endorsing them in every single corner. Just keep that one in mind. They're not infallible. It's not just that probably that we might disagree with the person on. So if I were to endorse, for example, this guy, and we talked about Ahmed Sayyid and what he was doing, this isn't necessarily to endorse each and every single thing and every single choice that he might take. Okay. The only one that we would take wholeheartedly is Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's it. Okay. Just keep that one in mind. That's why when we look at, for example, Malik ibn Anas, Imam Malik, what did he say? كل يؤخذ بقوله ويرد إلا صاحب هذا القبر. We would take the words of every single person and reject it. In other words, we are capable of accepting or rejecting the words, except the words of the one that resides in this grave, that is Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when we endorse, or when we probably would praise any figure for doing a certain activity or doing certain, let's say, dawah work, this isn't saying that everything that they are saying is necessarily something that I would embrace or something that I would approve of. Okay. And as for the thing about polygamy, there's no question that polygamy in Islam is permissible. There's no question about that. It's an ayah in the Quran. Yet scholars had differences of opinions on whether he has to take the permission from the first wife. Okay. So no scholar ever said that that's a condition in the marriage contract. I was saying, unless they're, according to the Hanbali madhab, unless the first wife had stated in the marriage contract that that he accepts, and that he would not be allowed to get married to a second, third, fourth wife. Okay. So that's according to the Hanbali madhab, but not all the rest of the madhab. But no madhab stated whatsoever that in order for a polygamous marriage, in other words, a polygamous relationship to take place, that it is a condition, or that the first wife's consent is a condition whatsoever. Unless there was a condition in the marriage contract, that's a different story. But if there is no condition, is the first wife's approval a condition to have this marriage contract be valid? The answer is no, it's not a condition. Would I recommend getting married without the first wife basically being aware, or basically consenting to this? Well, number one, no wife would consent. I would say rarely any wife would consent, let's say it that way. That's number one. Number two is that people have different circumstances. And certainly, we would hope that this person is acting with integrity and making the choices based on religious integrity. Okay. But at the same time, is the marriage contract going to be valid without the first wife's consent? Yes. But would we recommend it? The answer is no. We would usually, again, I would say usually, because there are certain cases that the person is really left with only one option, which is to probably handle the situation with wisdom. And it may be this wisdom is probably requiring that he would not disclose the second marriage yet until basically figures things out. Okay. Is this permissible? The answer is yes. Is it Is it recommended? I would not recommend it because we had seen many cases, where whether it's the husband dying or the children, basically unaware of all of this, and it basically starts bringing in a lot of, a lot of distrust and a lot of animosity. And certainly, whenever you're transparent about something, it basically creates the space where I would trust you. And certainly, if you're doing something behind the back, it just creates more room for feeling that you cannot be someone that I could trust because I don't know what you're doing, and especially if the woman is investing within that family. Meaning what? She's also working and he's also working. All of a sudden, the money is being used elsewhere. Now, that's definitely not fair. There's no question about that. If he's taking from her money to subsidize the family, I'm not talking about the second wife, but I'm talking about the home that they're living in. Okay. So if she's working to subsidize the family, well, it's not fair that you're basically now needing to use that money or needing to right now cut down on the spending that you are investing in, let's call it family one, because you had made the decision to basically distribute such income on more than one family, and then expect her, well, now you don't have the right to say anything because I'm basically the decision maker. There's a huge difference between him being the sole breadwinner and between being, I guess I would say, the joint breadwinner. The situation would be different. And number two, I would say, depending on the circumstance and the intention behind all of this, but I would usually not recommend this because definitely it brings in a lot of distrust. I would like to quote, can't remember his name, but a famous Shafi'i scholar. He said, we would not recommend polygamy because people had lost religious integrity. And the foundation and the basis of polygamy in Islam is al-adl, is justice. And when people had lost their religious integrity, they had definitely lost the application of it, which is al-adl and justice. But despite this opinion, is this something that I would say promotes and proves that polygamy is not permissible? There's no question that it's permissible in Islam, period. There's no question. Okay. And there doesn't have to be a reason. There's no question. Why? Because the ayah was really clear. ما طاب لكم من النساء. What you would desire. It didn't necessarily specify that, in situations of war or the wife is not capable of conceiving and all of that. It didn't necessarily condition polygamy to being for the specific reasons. Okay, so just wanted to note that one. Would we necessarily say that what the Shafi'i, at least not the Shafi'i himself, but the Shafi'i scholar, I can't remember the Shafi'i's name right now, at the top of my head, but I can quote him, inshallah, one day. But would we necessarily use that as, yeah, here's my evidence that you shouldn't be doing polygamy? The answer is no. And even there was this reel that was circulating of a hijabi woman saying, well, here's my evidence that polygamy is not permissible, that the Prophet ﷺ did not approve that Ali ibn Abi Talib would get a second wife. Well, she's not understanding that what Ali ibn Abi Talib was intending to do was marry Abu Lahab's daughter. So that's what the Prophet ﷺ did not want happening, because it was going to be harming the Prophet ﷺ and harming his honor by harming basically his daughter. Okay, so that does not whatsoever prove that polygamy is not permissible. That does not whatsoever. What's the evidence? Well, polygamy was practiced during the Prophet's time. The Prophet never disproved a certain polygamous marriage just because it's a polygamous marriage. And it was basically something that the Sahaba had practiced during the time of the Prophet, after the time of the Prophet, and certainly that was in practice of what the Quran was saying. So they understood the Quran better, they understood the Sunnah better, they understood the practice, and they understood the implementation. And to somehow take texts and incidents out of context, and out of context does not necessarily mean out of context of that situation, but out of context could also mean out of the context of understanding and interpretation. Okay, that would be a form of tahrif. That would be a form of editing Islam and editing the words of the Prophet. Okay, so just wanted to mention that one. So, and let's say, Allah yarda annik ya Rabbi. Maryam Habibti, I understand that so many times, during our times, some issues can be really sensitive because we're not used to it. And sometimes we can take certain issues, just like polygamy. I would say, number one, I come from a polygamous family, just a note. So I understand polygamy very well. And there are many out there, when they speak of polygamy, they speak of polygamy as if it's just a place of, if it's the women, it depends if it's a second wife, third, or whether it's the first wife. If it's a first wife, she would, perceive it as nothing but I would say hurtful. Let's just use that word. If it's a second wife, something that is promising. If it's a third wife, well, definitely another promising thing. Then I would say, if it's the men, as something that is entertaining, something that is fun, but they don't usually see what comes out of it. Okay, I would say in the ayah, and I did mention that one before, in the ayah when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned and فَلَا تَمِيلُوا كُلَّ الْمَيْلِ, that's one quote of it. And the second one is in the ayah, and we did go in details. It was giving وَإِن لَمْ تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدًا, if you fear that you would not be just, then stick to one. All those quotes are basically telling us that the probability of drama, stress, anxiety in polygamous marriages are more likely to happen than in monogamous marriages. There's no doubt about that. But would I consider that polygamy is something that is harmful, something that is to bring injustice? The answer is no, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would never permit something that carries injustice in it. Okay, that's number one. So if it is practiced right, it will bring good to the community. If it is practiced right. If it is practiced with one, justice, religious integrity, and understanding from the society itself, the women, the men, and the community that surrounds. By the way, I would like to say that when it comes to polygamy, it's a whole community that is involved within this marriage. It's a whole community. It's not just the wife and her relationship with this man, but it's the people, the society that surrounds the woman. And I had seen cases where a woman was okay with polygamy, but she was afraid that her integrity sorry, she was afraid that her honor was going to be harmed by the people that are surrounding her, that she was going to be seen as uh, the secondary, not the primary, is that she was going to be seen as the one that was left and not considered and all of that. And she was feeling that she was rather harmed in her honor. Okay. So I would say polygamy requires, before a man would take that approach, I would recommend, one, to make sure that the wife is the first wife or the second wife or whatever we're dealing with. One, they are understanding. Two, they're accepting. And three, we're not just talking about the wife and the first wife and the second wife and the third wife or whatever, but we're also talking about the children's mental health. This is something very important to keep in mind. The children's mental health and the wife's mental health is rarely talked about. It makes no sense to consider that we're just looking at one person or another person's sexual health and disregard the mental health of someone else. This is absolutely not wise. That's just the least to say, because when we look at the Islamic legal maxims, we look at that: one, preservation of deen; two, preservation of life; three, preservation of mental health; and preservation of sexual health and family. Whether mental health comes first or whether sexual health comes first, all of that, different opinions between scholars, but we definitely have to take in consideration the children's mental health, the wife's mental health, all of that. If the person is not capable of being man enough to embrace the society within this family and embrace their mental health, embrace their security, embrace all of that, then don't take this approach. Sorry. Maturity to embrace such a community, because polygamy is a community. It's involving more than one person. If the community is not mature enough to embrace it, I would say then do your homework in bringing in education, in bringing in the foundation to having this family that is capable of embracing such an idea before you would take such a position and break the mental health of a wife or a woman or the children, and probably at the expense of thinking that, well, as long as I'm sexually satisfied, that's all that matters. No, that's not the most thing that matters. What really matters is that you do it right. You do it with wisdom. You do it in a way that brings in a healthy community, a healthy family, and certainly a healthy foundation is what and how we would practice something that is mubah. If something that is mubah is going to bring harm, sorry, then you're not doing it right. You're not doing it right. When you practice something that is mubah, then you have to take in consideration the aftermath of what this brings. That's why, remember this, sadd al-dhara'i is actually key. Sadd al-dhara'i, in fact, is 2/3 of the religion. What is sadd al-dhara'i? Closing the means to evil. It's 2/3. Remember this ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَسُبُّوهُ. Well, don't swear at the different deities for the disbelievers. فَيَسُبُّ اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. Why not swear at Trinity, or probably the Ram or whatever, the different gods that they would be worshiping, or probably break them or harm these things right before their eyes? Well, because the ayah was saying, then they might actually approach this in bringing more harm to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is never going to be harmed, but this is basically putting them distant away from the religion. That's what it means. So if this is a practice that is generally halal, because this is not even a valid deity, but still the Quran had considered that don't use this method because the outcome and is going to basically bring a more dangerous approach. And that's something in da'wah. Same thing when we're speaking about something that is halal. If you want to practice it, you do it with wisdom. You do it in a way that brings basically, let's say, a good consequence, a good result, and not be an impulsive person and just think about their desire and just practice it and say, well, you know what, I'm going to practice that because it's halal and let the whole world collapse. That's not wisdom. That's childish. That's not wisdom, that's childish. That's not maturity. A mature person recognizes how to make the foundation right to bring about the channel to the best outcome. Do not be impulsive and act like a teenager. Make sure you act in wisdom. So I know you took us a little out of topic, but I thought it was important. And it was important to talk about this. But like I said, I personally don't encourage polygamy, but I would still not consider it as something that is not permitted. And certainly I don't encourage it, not because I'm a woman, but I would not encourage it because of the higher probability of injustice that happens within polygamous marriages. That's basically the stance, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't the best option for some. No, there are certain cases where this probably and maybe the best option for some people. So just leave that door open and just recognize that people's homes are basically covered with walls, and just recognize different homes are basically covered on so many issues and privacies. So don't judge and don't be fast in judging whether the men or the women in accepting to be in a polygamous marriage, because she also might have her reason to why she accepted in the first place. That is the second wife or the third wife. And certainly he might also have his reason to why he considered using and basically finding that as the alternative to probably different things that you may not know of. So I would just say, don't judge and don't be fast in judging, and take the time to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He had permitted such a rule and such a ruling, that He had done it with wisdom. And أَلَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ خَلَقَ وَهُوَ اللَّطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. Certainly the one that created is the one that is al-Latif al-Khabir. That is basically the Latif, the most subtle, what you don't recognize, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Khabir, all-knowing. Okay, so this really got us off topic, right? Really got us off topic, but I still needed to comment, I guess. وَقِيلَ وَمَنْ بَلَغَ الْحُلُمْ. Okay, تبليغ القرآن والسنة is basically obligatory. Delivering the message basically on Quran and Sunnah is obligatory, and the Prophet ﷺ had ordered that we would deliver it. And what is the evidence? Well, the Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, Ya ayyuha rasulu balligh ma unzila ilayka min rabbik. O Prophet of Allah, deliver what was revealed onto you. Okay, so is that referring to only the Quran? No, there are two things. Number one, tabligh is referring to two types of wahi. There's al-wahi that basically is the wahi, the words of the Quran. Basically, that's the wahi. There's the other type of wahi, basically. There's the other type of wahi that that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent with the Prophet ﷺ, basically the discipline, how to understand, how to interpret, and basically the sunnah itself. So sunnah is also a piece of wahi. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, وَمِثْلَهُ مَعَهُ. Basically, the Quran and مِثْلَهُ مَعَهُ is referring to the sunnah. And of course, in Sahih Bukhari, the Prophet ﷺ said, بَلِّغُوا عَنِّي وَلَوْ آيَةً. Deliver the message basically of what I had taught, even if it's just one verse in the Quran. وَحَدِّثُوا عَنْ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ وَلَا حَرَجْ. As for the different religious scriptures, or at least whether we're speaking about Bani Israel, whether we're speaking about Christians or Jews, that you could basically use their scripture. There's no problem to using that as an inspiration, but not necessarily as a way to interpret the religion. وَمَنْ كَذَبَ عَلَيَّ مُتَعَمِّدًا فَلْيَتَبَوَّأْ مَقْعَدَهُ مِنَ النَّارِ. And whoever purposely invents a lie and makes a lie of the Prophet ﷺ, then they would guarantee a spot for them in hellfire. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. In another hadith, من بلغته آية من كتاب الله فقد بلغه أمر الله أخذه أو تركه. Whoever basically received, even if it's just an ayah, they received a note, even if it's just one ayah, then the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was basically delivered to them. Whether they had embraced it or not is a different story. In the end, they had received and the message to them was delivered. Okay, let's see. And Muqatil, and we'll talk about Muqatil later on, but he said whoever had received the message of the Quran, whether from the jinn or whether from the humans, then that was a warning to them. Okay. من بلغه القرآن فكأنما قد رأى محمدا وسمع منه. And another scholar, al-Quradi, basically said whoever had received the message of the Quran, it is as if they had seen the Prophet, peace be upon him, Muhammad ﷺ, and even heard from him. In other words, you could have the Quran be recited at them, and that's basically right there what makes as if they had seen the Prophet ﷺ. أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَشْهَدُونَ أَنَّ مَعَ اللَّهِ آلَةً أُخْرَى. We said this isn't an interrogative clause. This isn't asking them, are you witnessing such and such, or what really are you believing in? This isn't a form of question or interrogative clause as much as it is تَوْبِيخٌ وَتَقْرِيرٌ. What does that mean? It's basically scolding them and exposing what they had believed in and what they had claimed in regards to the Lord Almighty and associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أَإِنَّكُمْ. Now there are different qira'at. أَإِنَّكُمْ and certainly أَإِنَّكُمْ, and you could see in that Hamza and how with the different qira'at, but really the meaning is the same. The meaning is the same. It's just أَإِنَّكُمْ. Here's a different qira'ah. And certainly the meaning is the same, but it's just different accents that the Arab had spoken in, and certainly with these different accents you can have different qira'at within it as well. Okay, and of course, for those that had said innakum and innakum, etc., so you could see it's basically coming in with a form of a confirmation or an affirmation right there. In other words, to bring further exposure that this is what you would actually believe in. Okay, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا فَمَا بَالُ الْقُرُونِ الْأُولَى. Okay, what did he want to say? Oh, that this is basically okay, just talking about the etymology of the word Allah. Okay, قُلْ لَا أَشْهَدُ. And now you, as in response to, it's not that this interrogative clause, but it's basically exposing them. But you come in and basically say, قُلْ لَا أَشْهَدْ, I do not bear witness that these deities are God, and stand up strong, basically. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to end right here with our that portion of tafsir, even though we got into polygamy more than the tafsir itself. But I guess I would say that's the fun thing when you're not restricted with a certain, I guess, curriculum. You kind of get the chance to get off topic sometimes, right? Yeah, that's fun. Okay, so if there are any questions, inshallah, would be happy to answer them, inshallah. I like the name Maryam al-Filibiniya, Sumaya, Rishma, mashallah, same people every day, mashallah, attending. So what we're going to do, we're going to stop